And we're recording, so I think it's a good time to start. Hello, everybody. Lovely to meet you. I'm Rik Moore. I'm Head of Insight, Strategy and Planning at the Kite Factory. And joining me on the other tile on the gallery screen is Joe Wade, who's a founder of the creative agency Don't Panic. And the title of today's Lunch and Learn webinar is How Earned Media Can Supercharge Your Marketing Strategy. I'm really interested in this one. So at the Kite Factory, we historically, we're a paid media agency, we buy media space. But coming in and setting up the strategy department and thinking about our planning process, which we call Flight Path, what I'm increasingly interested in doing, and through the experience I've had in my 20 years in media, is how can we use different touch points to really make that paid media work its hardest. And how we think of that is owned, earned, shared, paid, and we think about it in that order. So how we define it, because I think definition is going to be very important for the webinar we're about to have. Owned is anything you control yourself. You have editorial control over what goes on there. You don't have to pay to make the content go on there, but you control the output. That's your own channels, could be your website, could be your social channels, could be anything else in the mix. Earned, which we're coming to focus on today, is all about people advocating on your behalf. So that might be if you're a charity or supporter, if you're a commercial client, it might be fans of the given brand. It could be journalists, experts, anybody raving about your product effectively. Now they might be using content you've made to do that, or they might be saying their own story about it, but that's what Earned's about. Shared becomes working with other commercial partners to try and amplify your message and get it out there and achieve mutually beneficial goals. And that's when the paid then comes in at its most effective, because it's either amplifying the good stuff or filling the gaps that can't get to, or just helping move the whole story along. And that's how we're increasingly thinking about our channels we've built onto our planning process. And of those four, I think earned is the most intriguing because it's probably the most nebulous. It's the hardest to define in some ways. But it's a sum of many different parts and many different skill sets. And that's why I'm particularly interested to be sharing this platform today with Joe, because we'll come on to learn more about the agency Don't Panic. What really struck me about them, we met when Joe was successfully pitching for WaterAid, which we both work on. Now it's a fantastically innovative charity, do some really interesting stuff. And what struck us about Don't Panic when we saw them pitch is they were talking about the idea that every single creative idea that comes out is critiqued for will this drive earned engagement, which is a really bold statement, a really interesting way of thinking about the creative process. And as we've gone on to work with Joe and the brilliant people at Don't Panic, it's really struck me just how interesting that is and how many new opportunities that opens up. It's a gauntlet down for media, which is how can you match that creativity to make it work as hard as possible. So I'm very pleased to welcome Joe. So we're going to talk a little bit about the journey Joe's been on to get to that point, and then we're going to talk a bit about both our experiences of earned media and what we've learned from that, which will then, towards the end of the webinar, we'll get into what we think some golden rules to make the most of earned media are, that hopefully give you some food for thought to go away and think about how you might take into your own businesses. And then there'll be space at the end for questions. So we'll probably try and talk about 40 minutes, but then we'll leave space at the end. There is the chat function, so do please, if you want to ask us anything, let us know. We're also, if the button in the top corner is telling me correctly, recording this, so you will get to see a link, see a copy after the fact. So don't worry if you miss stuff with notes, we'll be following up on that. I think that's all the housekeeping. So then it's great to introduce Joe. So Joe, you went on a very interesting journey to having a creative agency, because we were talking about the first time I saw Don't Panic was in the mid-noughties, and it's generally as I was coming out of, I think it was the Islington Academy, I got handed this brown envelope of interesting flyers and stickers and posters, and it had Don't Panic branding on it, and that's where you began, right?
Yeah, so we started, I think there is a thread, which I'll come on to in a bit, but we started off in about, the millennium. We started off, really, my colleagues were inspired. Do you remember Y2K? And then everyone thought the world was going to collapse. So that's why we called it Don't Panic, because of Y2K. That's how old it is. And we started a kind of print-based business just at the cusp of the internet. And people did used to contact us going, do you do websites? And we said, no, they'll never catch on. So we stuck with flyers. And then but I think what we did, which was interesting at the time, was that was when flyer packs were almost like a sort of, instead of social media, you had to rely on flyers because there was not even MySpace at this point, and to find out what was going on. And I guess what we did, because there were lots of these flyer packs out there, was two things which I think are relevant to how we try and work now, which was firstly, we decided to make them more than just hedonism. So it wasn't just condoms, and that was in the days when you can give out lighters and Rizzlers and everything like that. And then and there was PlayStation flyers, and there was lots of like fun stuff. And then we thought we want to put some causes or issues in with this, and so we created this Don't Panic poster. And then we used to get, so the first two were done by Banksy, and then he, you know, so I do actually still have his number. So he would come to the office and you know, and I used to reject his designs. So it was in those days and go, no. And so he would design posters for us around themes that would usually be environmental or social issues. And then we got Shepherd Ferry, who went on to do like the Obey posters and people like this. And so they would produce these posters that then would go up, because these packs were going all over the country in universities and bars and stuff, and students would stick them on the wall, and then they would learn about issues and causes a bit. So that was kind of trying to make it entertaining. And I think the other thing we learned a bit about in those days was trying to find an audience, you know, like where were people going? So it wasn't just clubs, it was sort of cinemas and bars, and sort of trying to have a network of, but always independent, never going near any chains. So we were trying to find like cool people basically. And then, yeah, so that was how the company started. Yeah.
Fantastic. And then you were starting to put content out there, right? You were starting to embrace YouTube and make those films, and that sort of led you to your TV successes, but also to the creative agency.
Well, I think it was in about 2008 and 2009, we were reading a lot about the banking bailout and the MP's expenses scandal. And those two issues were covered extensively in the broadsheets and mainstream news, but no one was really doing it for younger people via YouTube. So we had, and I think this is what informed how we work really to this day, is we didn't have any media budget and we didn't have any real production budgets, but we wanted to create content that alerted people and helped them learn about these topics. And so we used to make very kind of like stunty films. And I think the bit where they became quite big was when we went to there's a guy called Alan Duncan, who was a Tory MP, he still is a Tory MP, and he was on the front bench at that point, and he'd been claiming for his gardening expenses. So then we went to his house and we dug a giant pound-shaped flower bed in his lawn and then planted it really nicely like a big pound sign. Yeah, and then we hid, like, you know, so we had a money tree in his garden and stuff. And then but then what we would do is we would go back to the office, edit the film, and then we'd send images out to all the newspapers. So we were very focused on not just shares and the virality of the content, but we always wanted to get PR. So then it was quite a big news story, and the video did really well and traveled. And then he wasn't too pleased, and then he invited my colleague, who actually dug the pound sign, into the Houses of Parliament. And then, but my colleague had a secret camera on him and videoed their drink, and the drink, Alan Duncan, you know, who was front bench at that point, said MPs are treated like shits and have to live on rations. And then we kind of didn't really pay that much heed because we were quite naive, and then we just put it on our website. And then about a week or so later, we went to Nobu, that restaurant that in the mid-noughties, as you say, was quite, you know, people thought it was cool then. It's not, you know, and the one that's a Japanese restaurant, and then owned a bit, and then we, it had endangered bluefin tuna on the menu. So then we went there and we delocked the doors, and then we put a big sign saying "Gone fishing for bluefin tuna" on the door. And then there were loads of journalists there because it was a certain one, paparazzi, I guess, who were taking loads of pictures of it, of the celebrities who may have been there. And then that got loads of coverage in the Evening Standard and stuff. And then people went on the website and uncovered the Alan Duncan video. And then it was one of those weird things where it was like front page news, and everyone was on Newsnight, and it went, and then he got sacked. And then at that point we got contacted by various production companies to make TV series. Yeah.
And that's where you did, so it's The Revolution will be televised.
Yeah, so we made 3 series of that, and then the first series won a BAFTA for Best Comedy, and then second series was BAFTA nominated and we didn't win. Third series, nothing, BAFTA-wise. But yeah, so it's like diminishing returns. But then we made, then we made that, and then we've made, like, essentially the business Don't Panic exists at an intersection between kind of cause-related campaigns and entertainment and sort of but I think some of the other, so a lot of our strengths now as a business are because we have the links with TV creators, so in terms of storytelling, but maybe we'll come onto that later. But I think, and then we made some other quite viral things in other series. So we made a series for BBC Two called Revolting, which didn't do as well, but one huge which I've only just kind of reconsidered now when I was thinking about news, was there was a sketch we did called The Real Housewives of ISIS, and then that became, which was done like The Real Housewives, as you can imagine, but and then that became like a sort of global viral sensation. Then we all had to change our phone numbers, and then 2 of the talent had to have bodyguards and stuff because they had loads of death threats. And then, but then, yeah, a weird thing that happened was, at first there was a bit of a backlash, and then there was a kind of like backlash against the backlash that said that actually nothing's beyond satire. So we felt like it was sound, but you know, it's kind of pertinent to the slightly febrile atmosphere we're in now, you know, in terms of would you do that now, you know, possibly not. But the so yeah, that was our kind of journey. But I suppose now we're focused very much on helping either cause related clients such as War Trade, or brands who have a strong sense of purpose, I suppose.
Yeah, fantastic. And I guess that's where we can maybe dovetail into a bit more of the lessons I've learned, and you've touched on a lot of the themes there. But I mean, let's give some examples of some of the bigger campaigns you've run. I mean, obviously we've just started the Water Aid journey. You've got the Bring Water and the Rainbows creative, which hopefully people have been seeing on different media channels, and incredibly well bought and planned media. But also we've got the I think one of the most famous pieces from you guys has been the work you've done with the Wildlife Trust, the Wind in the Willows work. Yeah,
well, there was that. Yeah, I mean, I think probably the transition going in a sort of like chronological way, probably the kind of breakthrough thing we did for a client. There were two in a row, and this was in the days before. This is, I think, now, in terms of how, you know, important paid media is. Back in the days when we were making these 2 things I'm about to discuss, it was possible to make something truly viral in the sense of the algorithms allowed, you know, you to reach all your own followers at least, you know, without paying anything. But obviously now that's not possible. Yeah. So this was in the days before we understood the importance of paid. But the first one we did was for Save the Children, and it was called Most Shocking Second a Day, in which a young girl, it was to do with the 3rd year anniversary of the war in Syria. And it was a young girl who's in London, and her life essentially falls to pieces in the similar way to, you know, how children's lives were destroyed in Syria. So these were normal middle class people, and their lives went to shit. And that was a huge, like, viral success that globally, and then kind of raised awareness, and some of the techniques I suppose we deployed in that, it is quite a good case study. There was an app at that point called the Second a Day app, where parents would film their children for a second a day on this app, and it would splice it together into a film, like a year in the life of type film. And it was really, really popular, and loads of parents were showing these videos. So we took that format, and that's why it was Most Shocking Second a Day. And I think that kind of thinking has always underpinned. So I think looking at existing behaviors and then applying them to a creative idea was key to that. So that's one thing in terms of lessons learned for us. And one thing we'd always recommend to clients is looking at what is popular online now. I know it sounds simple, but then and then applying that. And that in that case, it was a format where it was edited very quickly between different scenes. So we filmed a vast amount of scenes and spliced them together, and you saw a life change. Another sort of insight for that was you couldn't go, in those days, charity films were often done in the location to which an appeal was targeted. So if in that case, it would have meant filming in Syria, which we couldn't do. And we didn't have any, there wasn't much money to do that anyway. So, but the good thing about that was we filmed that story in London, and that sort of global north, the developed world kind of perspective made the empathy much more strong. So we had a much more direct appeal because people could see it as their own children who were suffering in this way. And then that's become I think that was really influential, because that then led that I think alerted charities to actually people want to see themselves in things and want to see a human face to something that they can really identify with. And I think that was the kind of big breakthrough moment for us as an agency, because before that we were a media company. Then the second one we did, which I'm going to, hopefully there's some good sort of lessons in these as well, which was the second one we did was for Greenpeace at that point, and it was called Everything's Not Awesome. And that was done, basically the idea was, how can Greenpeace strategically reach new audiences who don't like seeing people climbing up chimneys and doing all of that kind of activism? Because Greenpeace is actually quite divisive it was, I think it's changed now. So what we did, this was an Arctic appeal, and what they were trying to do, which I think was really an interesting focus, because it made it a news story. And as I said, we're very keen on PR as well, was to try to divest Shell from Lego, because if you go in a Shell garage, you used to be able to get these Lego figures of people, who were racing drivers and stuff. So they wanted to break that partnership. So we did a Lego diorama, kind of beautiful Lego scene. It gradually got submerged with oil, and it was, it did really well. And and at that point, a few lessons for us. And the reason that did so well is it also came out at the same time as the Lego film, the Lego movie, which has got the soundtrack Everything's Awesome. So we tapped into a huge kind of cultural moment that was trending. We also then, from a tactical point of view, and this is a tactical way of earning media that we found worked really well in this case, because we had the Lego diorama, the Lego scene, we could then add different characters from different sort of online verticals. So we had, we put Jon Snow from Game of Thrones, we had Hedwig from Harry Potter, we put in Master Chief from Halo, so we got the gamers. And then what we did in-house was we contacted all the Game of Thrones fan sites, of which there were many at that point, and told them about the video. I think 12 of them put it up for free. And then we did the same thing with Harry Potter and gaming sites. And that enabled us, I think we got something like 75% new audience reach for that. So it was so there was the kind of, I'd say, the strategic thing was using a Lego and Shell partnership to interest people in the Arctic and global warming and Greenpeace. And then there was a kind of almost like operational level somewhere between strategic and tactical, which was the sort of, the film was out, so it was a good cultural moment. And then the tactical level was that insertion of cultural touch points in the film, and then in-house contacting all of these fan sites. And so in that way, we earned masses of media.
Which is phenomenal. And there's so much you can learn from that idea of making yourself relevant. And I think we talk a lot about behavior change in advertising these days. And one of the biggest routes to success for using behavior change is, how can you use what you're doing to align to what people's goals are? Because if you help people achieve their goals, they're more likely to listen to you. and you start to get that relevance. And it's interesting that seeding tactic with the different fan groups. It's the way of tapping into that relevant moment as well, with the film being out and the soundtrack, and it's using that, leveraging that to your benefit. And it seems, as we start talking about these examples, I love the fact the second a day there was that insight about that's a behaviour, that's a trend that's there, and how do you take that into the creative brief? How do you pull that in? And having worked with you, I've seen how you've done that a lot. I think it's really interesting how you bring that to life, which again, for us as a media agency, becomes an interesting challenge to say, right, well, how do you amplify that? How do you take that out there? As you say, with the challenges with the algorithms and the sheer volume of content out there, how do you cut through? And I think that relevancy and that there's also I think the word you'd use is an authenticity. There's an authenticity to how you're engaging those, Lego figures and trading into those different fan groups. That's a really interesting way of building that connection and building that closeness. I think that's something we've always found with charities, which is how can you create that proximity to cause? How can you drive engagement, that people feel close to what you're trying to achieve and close to what you're trying to land? That's really interesting how you've done that. So those are two great examples. We've also got, like I said, The Wind in the Willows, which seem to follow similarly, tapping into something that pulled on, for an older audience, a lot of heartstrings, for a younger audience, and it was pertinent at the time, but then spinning it into the narrative of what the charity wants to talk about.
Well, I think it's good to talk about it now, because it did win. It just won a D&AD actually, and it was, but it did a really good job for the wildlife trusts, and I think they were looking. It was part of a bigger campaign we produced called A Wilder Future, which is trying to be, and the point of it is to get people, all generations, to care about the degradation of the wildlife in the UK, which is quite, 50% of wildlife has been lost, and I think there's quite a convenient. So we had this Wilder Future campaign, which is still ongoing, and it's very, it's sort of an optimistic and very flexible kind of campaign platform that they're still using. But I think to bring it to life, we wanted to create something that, even with the restrictions that abound today, that did have a lot of shareability, but also and the capacity to activate people. And so I think the good thing about the Wind in the Willows, as you say, Rick, is a bit like the way that I suppose we did look to Hollywood for answers, because they brought back, big films versions of Paddington, and then there's Paddington 2, and then there's Winnie the Pooh and Christopher Robin. And so a lot of these old British, Mary Poppins, these things have all come back and been reimagined. And I think for us, the good thing about Wind in the Willows was it was out of copyright because it's that old. So you could lift that property for free, and then you've already got that name recognition, without having to pay anything for it. And then you can, which does explain why there's so many remakes of things like Dracula, doesn't it? Because it's like they're just there for the taking. And so having done that, then we wanted to tell the story of how the riverbank has been, decimated in the last 75 years. So essentially you go back to the riverbank thinking you're about to watch this sweet film trailer. It starts off in that way, and then it's a sort of twist where you see the riverbank has been, destroyed, and then the gang are, bereft, but then they rally at the end to kind of start this campaign. And I think, it's beautifully stop frame animated, and we presented it and we launched the whole campaign like a film. So we managed to, and this is more applicable for charities, but we got, I think it was something like 15,000 screenings of the trailer in cinemas for nothing that DCM did for us, and they were in with the film trailers rather than the ads, so that was really good. And then we also got loads and loads of free outdoor, and which was really helpful. And then you're probably thinking, stop talking about free stuff.
No, I'm going to come on. I'm going to make you my own free stuff. I'm not against free stuff.
Okay. No, we paid a lot for it. And it was worth it. And then we, so then, and I think its success was in terms of the, well, another really helpful thing was, because of the strength of the idea and what we were doing, we got Stephen Fry did Badger's voice. We had Asim Chowdhury, who people might know as Jabadi G from People Just Do Nothing, did Toad, and then we had Alison Steadman was Mole, and we had Catherine Tate as Ratty, and so we got a good cast, and then David Attenborough did the voiceover, so it was pretty all-star cast. And I think, you know, I wouldn't, you know, in terms of a learning from that, the what I think about the use of celebrities is that they provide great PR hook. I don't think they necessarily, when you look at the sort of, when we kind of analyze the social response, not that many people are like, wow, Jabadi G's in this, but it's more like, I think it gets you a lot of press, and then you also get, so like it's worth mentioning, got 3 double-page spreads in national newspapers, you know, and it was helped by, you know, David Attenborough being in it. So that's not something anyone can just whip out the air. But so I think there were a lot of layers. But also the really gratifying thing about it was it got shown in loads of school assemblies, and there were loads of kids interacting with it. Loads of people wanted us to make it for real. So we're trying to investigate making it as an actual film. And then it drove some good results. It got, I think, about over 7,000 people signed up to join. It's like 80 quid to join. So it's it definitely just in that way easily had a good ROI. So it's kind of yeah, and yeah, I think it sort of goes to show the sort of, and then we took, you know, the characters, the models, we took them out to like Extinction Rebellion protests. We took them around, we photographed them. We had shitloads of social content from it. So it was really good campaign. Yeah.
No, and I think it taps into so many brilliant things. And what I love is it's not just, here we've had this mad idea, let's throw it out there, see if it works. It's the level of thinking and planning and expertise that goes into it, which if stuff's free, it's worth paying for, the expertise. So that's how we get around that. Yeah. But it's the fact you've brought it back to an ROI. So it doesn't have to be agnostic of performance. It doesn't have to stand away from what objectives are. And I think that can sometimes dissuade people from embracing some of the more creative ideas out there. I don't think it requires necessarily bravery to do these things. It just needs the business rationale being made for why you would, you know, entrust in doing it. What I also like is, like you say, with the David Attenborough doing the voiceover, not every brand can do that. Not every single person can do it. And I think it's interesting, and it's something I've noticed from working with you, is that you cannot at any stage rest on your laurels of that works, we'll just replicate it. It's almost that gauntlet down to you that each stage you have to keep being continually creative to find new ways of cracking it, which I think is that's very inspiring to be around. So if we start to turn the conversation around, I think that's been a brilliant snapshot about your agency, and lots we can learn from there, and lots that I want to continue the chat beyond this webinar about. But I guess what I wanted to do to make this as useful for people watching as possible is if we could both start to think about the what are the golden rules of making the most of earned. And I think I know you have your secret sauce, which we're not going to get into, you know, the 11 herbs and spices of
well, no, I don't mind saying some of that. I mean, yeah, it's fine. Yeah, I don't mind. I think knowing those things is actually helpful for people, which is, you know, is fine with me. But I also think it's the application of them that lots of people find difficult. Yeah. I mean, yeah. So, yeah. Oh,
anybody else lost the sound? There's just one of the questions popped up. I think we're okay. Anybody else on the chat? Has it come back? Okay. Okay, it sounds like people can hear it. I apologise if your sound is cut out for anybody. The recording will be made available to, if you've signed up for this, you will get sounds afterwards. So, so that's good. Excellent. Okay, good to check that. So, okay, if you're okay to talk about your checklist, maybe we start there, and then we'll go into some of the overall observations we've seen.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the things, I mean, the main overarching element, sort of a simple thing, I suppose, for us that we always hold on to is, would I share this? Which is a kind of, you know, is a sort of, and it is quite difficult. I suppose that's the purpose of an agency, to kind of bring along a sort of clear-eyed view, and who's maybe not as embedded in a brand as people who work in it. But I think if you ask yourself, would I share this? That is a good starting point, because, you know, as I said, where our philosophy is to try and imagine we don't have any media budget. And if you sort of imagine that, then you have to sort of be quite focused on the entertainment value. And a couple of the things we try to remind ourselves of are, you need to earn the right to interrupt someone's day, you know. And I think if an advert is too addy and it's too sort of almost like self-centered, it's not going to have the capacity to earn much media. And I suppose, you know, and I think so there needs to be some sort of value exchange, I think. So you need to be thinking of, there's, would I share it? And then what are some of the reasons people would share it? And I think one of the main thing is a value exchange. And I think that is, does it have an emotional resonance? And I would include being funny in that. And, you know, we could talk about that maybe in a bit, but I do think there is a dearth of funny ads that are, you know, genuinely funny. I think there used to be more, but I think that is a big area which there is opportunity. And so, but I think, but yeah, my main thing is probably say, would I share it? And if so, on what grounds? And I think the main thing has got to be this value exchange. It doesn't just have to be emotional resonance. There's other things like, does it have enough information, or is there some kind of utility to it? Does it offer more than just a commercial message? And yeah, and I think you need to kind of get those sorted, that sort of thing sorted, before then thinking of, I will get the list out in a minute, but just the kind of ones that occur to me most often are things like the cultural relevance. So does it tap into a trend or a zeitgeist? There's also a different kind of thing, which is a more like the example of the most shocking second a day. Does it comply with some kind of existing habit or behavior that people exhibit online? So is it kind of easily relatable? And then I think kind of a counterpoint to those sorts of things is the looking like a disco vicar or dad at the disco, with a kind of desperate attempt to kind of join a conversation from a brand that has no particular right to join that conversation. So there's also that, and that doesn't need to necessarily be as so that's just whether or not, you know, if something is trending, whether there is a good answer to those questions, or is it desperate looking. So I think there's that component as well. I mean, other things, I think, you know, other things, I guess, to do with going back to the more almost like technical side of it, which is, there's quite a good YouTube graph that you can probably, this is more to executional point. So there's quite a good YouTube graph which has got a traditional story arc against what they call an emerging story arc. And I'll send this to Rik to send around, which is, our client from WaterAid also pointed out the drop-off rate, you know, on Instagram anyway, and probably the same sort of thing on Facebook is 3 seconds, you know. So if you really do need to have something happening that's pretty enticing at the beginning of any kind of work to grab people's attention. And I think what traditional ad agencies struggle with a bit is they're still psychologically very wedded to a traditional story arc, which I think, you know, a traditional film story arc is a sort of 3-act structure, isn't it? Where you have a kind of the setup, everything goes wrong in the second act. So the setup's the first act, everything goes wrong in the second act. The third act, everything is resolved. Whereas Whereas an advert, I think, has a 2-act structure, which is here's a problem, and then here's the solution. The solution is our brand or product or whatever. But with digital and online and social, you need a different story arc, which is something happens within those first 3 or 4 seconds, that really grabs people's attention, and that's something that you really need to consider, I think, because if you don't have that and you have a sort of traditional ads thing where the resolution is at the end, so many people, won't reach the end, or they barely get to the middle. So it's kind of and that doesn't, I don't think that necessarily means everything has to be really, really short, because you can get something that's short and crap that people it still won't have an effect, and you can get something that's long and brilliant that could be really groundbreaking and effective. But to give yourself the best opportunity to get across something really good and original, you do need to consider that story arc, and making sure you challenge any agency to say, why will people still be watching at this point? And I think for us, we have engagement strategists, and their job is to constantly work in a collaborative way with the creative teams to make sure we are paying attention to what is the sort of best practice in that regard. Sorry, I feel like I've just been rambling for ages.
No. I didn't want to interrupt you, because I thought it was absolutely spot on. I love that idea of giving the best opportunity to fly. I think that's something when we chat to clients and we think about how we drive engagement, is how do you set things up with the best chance of success. I mean, one of the things that always strikes me about Earned is we've talked a lot about the creative and when the creative needs to work. There's also the other intangibles. There's the media, how are we planning it? How are we putting it from people? In the way we act in that media delivery, what's the behavior we're showing? How do we grab people's attention? When, like you said there, they might be consuming it on their phone. And there's a phrase, a very bright strategist used to work with, Hannah used to have, which is about the idea of the unsatisfied swipe. People are just constantly scrolling, looking for those hooks to interrupt them. Is there a way we can land the media buying that can bring that to life? Likewise, the idea, and it comes into that emerging story piece you talked about, which is the idea of how do we land that concept of the PR? How do we make the PR so it's not just one thing? I think we talked about the correspondence between a big explosion and a firework display. How do you keep the PR story going? And one of the big, I think his failures historically there's been a lack of understanding about PR. PR is sometimes seen as a bit of a dark art or a very simplified thing, which is just get people to write about it. And, the more time you spend with PR professionals, it's no, we need a very, very long lead time. We need to seed these stories with journalists. We need to give them a reason to buy into it. Yes, there can be those quick, do you need to fill column inches, or here's an interesting story that will appeal to a readership, and you get a double-page spread like you had with Wind in the Willows. But it's that act of how can you get PR involved early on, and also how can you understand what they need to drive engagement at their point, that they can start to build to those big explosions. But then how can you add those micro explosions so you get the firework display and that lovely analogy through that side of it. And then we have sorry, I'm being heckled to be close to the microphone. I hope that improves it for people. So first of all, let's understand that PR moment for everybody. Then there's the whole idea of how do you utilize every single touch point. And this was I think how I started into media earlier on in my career. There were two things that really stood out. One was I was working on Adidas back in 2003. We launched a new football boot called the F50. It had a very cool sort of stenciled logo and this almost like biohazard logo. And the insight we had is you get out and about on the streets, you see school kids walking with carry bags. They have those drawstring carry bags that the trainer shops like JD Sports and people would give you. And they were just falling apart. They were absolutely in tatters. And the insight we had, well, why do they do that? And we started to think about it, and we came with the idea of, well, because they don't want to be seen dead with a uncool, like a supermarket carry bag. They want that. They love that carry bag. It speaks to them. Could we give out carry bags around the time of launch so people walk around so they become physical billboards for us? So you almost, again, it's on a very, very basic level. It's what you talked about before. It's understanding what's the existing behavior and how can you align with what they're trying to achieve so there's more chance they will engage with you. And they became these walking billboards. You talked about with Wind in the Willows borrowing from a different category, borrowing from film and a film release. We did that. I worked on the launch of the Toyota Aygo car, and it was a really tricky thing because Toyota Aygo, Citroen C1s, and Peugeot 107s are all made ostensibly in the same factory and all essentially the same car. Those other two brands had a lot more heritage in terms of how could they engage from a youth point of view. But we treated it, they were very specific when they launched it. Toyota said it's the Aygo by Toyota, and we want to have this roundel which looks very different to anything Toyota had done before. And we said, brilliant, well, why don't we borrow something from the record industry and why don't we behave like a music brand? And we used a lot of the, like the fly posters, and we used, presence at music festivals. We used things at the time were fairly groundbreaking for a car, less so now, but at the time really stood out. And again, it's looking for that moment that aligns it. So I think that's a very good golden rule, that truism, that alignment. The next thing we've gone to is when we launched, I worked on Just Eat for an 8-year period. And one of the biggest success stories of that was how we used every single touch point. And for me, again, that's a big part of Earned, which is how do you harness everything to add to the noise. And this was around the time we launched the Don't Cook, Just Eat iteration of the brand. We did a couple of things. Number one, having made the film we were very proud of for the ad, we took the entire staff out. It's about 1,000 people, so a lot of their call center staff. We took them out and we created a big night out and we showcased, we premiered the movie, and we made them very proud of the movie, very proud of that they worked for a company that made something like this, but also getting collateral to go and talk about. Other little things we did was we changed, because it was about Don't Cook, Just Eat. The idea was there was this group of angry takeaway chefs annoyed that the nation was cooking, and they're encouraging you to order more takeaways. What we did was we made everybody's job title in the company, the existing job title, and anti-cooking activist. And each auto signature was an explanation of what they were doing to strike back against the tyranny of cooking. But that's such a simple thing, but everybody in the company lead into it, and suddenly you've got 1,000 voices ready to go out and talk to people. Every interaction they send an email to starts to do it. So it's those little things laddering up to the big things, which I guess, I was using the phrase before, and it's a phrase borrowed from the likes of YouTube, which is this hero hub hygiene. But it's this idea of there are different sizes of this. Yes, there can be, in like the Wind in the Willows example, a standalone huge piece, but then there can be smaller temples or smaller activations that ladder up to one story. And I think that's an interesting thing for Earned, is how do we enable that conversation to go over time? You touched on Extinction Rebellion before, and that they become an interesting example of looking into how they become such a big name. Is there's a difference between mobilize and organize, in that you can get a lot of people talking about a thing. That's great. How do you continue the journey? And I know for both of our companies that becomes big when we talk to people, is how do you stop it being just a one-off? How do you give them somewhere to go to find out more information, or have a longer-term dialogue? And I think that side of engagement comes through. And again, a lot of the examples you've talked about, how can we engage so that we engage in a way that is interesting, that people want to continue the conversation, but also, this is really what you brought up there, the idea of the disco vicar, which is an interesting way of being. How can you be authentic and relevant? How you're not just turning up in the conversation and being really awkward and not useful for people. Have you ever seen that go particularly wrong? When people have tried to be authentic and it's backfired on them?
I mean, I suppose the most classic example is Pepsi, isn't it? I guess the kind of to me, that's a sort of standout example of, an excruciating disaster, is the Kendall Jenner advert where she, quells a riot with a Pepsi, and so I think that's, a pretty disastrous example. I mean, there's lots of, there's kind of recent ones in terms of brands, companies trying to sort of look good, but doing it in a half, I think Amazon giving, £250,000 to, it is interesting actually, this kind of relationship between Amazon, Amazon gave £250,000 to the UK's bookshops, and it's kind of, well, that is that worse than doing nothing? Because actually, Jeff Bezos himself earns like $8 million a day. So it's kind of, that company's got such vast resources that does it look worse doing, sorry about that. Does it look worse doing, that's made them look worse by doing something that in theory is good. So it is interesting. And and I personally feel like the kind of our work is is sort of being on the kind of more socially conscious kind of purposeful end is quite a good place to be, because we are perhaps quite able to navigate, what it seems to be an increasingly like politicized environment, certainly on social media. And I think it's difficult for people to be sure-footed in that kind of environment. And like, I think other brands that do it that I find very irritating are, and I don't know whether you might know whether this is successful. I hope I don't think you work with them. So I hate HSBC's adverts with a passion, because they go, hey, you are London, you are this, you're multicultural. And it's like, you are HSBC, who have taken money from drug dealers and are, have enabled tax avoidance and are, and so I find those sorts of ads, very irritating on a personal level, but I don't know how. And then I think they've tried to do something recently around coronavirus, like, we're just here to help. And everyone knows, banks aren't helpful and they are mostly evil. So it's kind of like, I find it pretty appalling when they do try to look like they're good.
Yeah. I mean, I think, you use the phrase sure-footed, and I think that's the interesting thing, which is some of those feel like they clang slightly. We saw the thing in the trade press last week, L'Oreal coming out, Black Lives Matter, but actually being very hypocritical about the situation they'd had in 2017, and it's very awkward. And I think, for a lot of marketeers, it's what's the right thing to do, where do you step on issues? And I think it's, as we think about earned, it's relevancy and authenticity isn't just how you talk to consumers, it's how you behave and it's how you act. And it's for agencies like us working with marketeers, and the marketeers, it's almost that trinity of knowing what the brand stands for, knowing what the brand wants to say, and being true to that. And it's not just thinking campaign to campaign, because that leads you to ditch to ditch sort of marketing. It's what is that longer term journey you want to go on. And I think some clients have a fear of, I don't want to go into that space, I shouldn't be there, and they're nervous about the first step. I think there should be less nervousness about the first step, as long as there's a commitment that there are ensuing steps that take you on the journey. It's those ones that are the blips that go nowhere.
Well, I mean, my view, I don't think it's the job of comms to, polish a turd, as it were, because it's kind of like, if you are that sort of, if you do want to have these kind of project that kind of opinion, about social issues, I think you do have to first get your own house in order, and there needs to be, Gillette were another kind of huge misstep, was for Gillette when they tried to jump on Me Too with that advert, at the barbecue, and Gillette has absolutely no right to be in that space, because their ads before that were basically Tiger Woods, someone, he's obviously a friend, woman, he's hardly a feminist. And so you've got Tiger Woods there, Roger Federer, I don't know anything, I'm sure he seems quite nice, but it's still, they were just sportsmen shaving. You went from sportsman shaving to, we're going to tell men how to act around women. And it's like, well, and then the other sort of, talking of clangers, the other point that went really wrong was that it turned out the women's razors, the Venus ones, which are often pink, cost more. So it was like a tax on women. So it was kind of like Gillette were, that was just something, either do it, go for whole hog, lower. But if they had just said, right, we're equalizing the price of the women's razors at that point, we're going to do X, Y, and Z into the future, but still, I don't think you come out with the advert then, the didactic, ad. Rick, I was just thinking, given the time, should we ask if anyone's got any questions, or is that have I jumped the gun a bit there?
No, that's perfectly reasonable with a sense of time. Just what people maybe are thinking, I just to echo the point there, I think that getting the house in order, that's a huge step for some people, but at least it's showing you're willing to move and doing it. It's the old, don't tell me a funny, tell me a joke. I think people want evidence, they want action. And I think that's an interesting space where you can start to talk and start to behave and showcase what you're doing. And if we talk about that engagement piece, how we continue the conversation, move it along, it might be it's in an ad, you make that initial interruption, that hook you talk about, but then it's how do you show people what you're doing and hopefully drive that alignment. Not a wealth of questions coming through. So I think I might use this opportunity then to maybe sum up some of the themes we've talked about, which is, how do we drive the best from earned media? So we talked about, I think the key one comes through is this idea of the authenticity, if I can say the word, and relevancy. How are you authentic? How is it true to the way you act and behave? But also, how are you relevant to the conversation? But also relevant to the way people are having that conversation. How do you ensure that you are, not just clangingly coming to that conversation, that you're landing it in a smart way. It's understanding the needs of PR, and one that it's not just a single eruption, but it's lots of little interventions in and around, and giving that specialism the right time and space to land those. Thinking about how you can utilize every single touch point. So we talked about just the example of bringing the staff on and using their voices. We talked about the Extinction Rebellion. We touched on it, the idea of not just mobilizing people, but organizing repetitively over time. I think one thing people miss is asking, asking people to do things, being very specific about what you need. I think that's an interesting space to consider. When we consider behavior change, it's connecting with people's own goals and what they want to achieve and what they want to do. Thinking in different sizes, so it's not just one piece of creative, but it's lots of different sizes, lots of different ways of working. Thinking to maximize earned about how owned, shared and paid support that and amplify that become really, really crucial. We talked about seeding, in terms of seeding messages out there, that you talked about everything not being awesome and how you connected with the different fan bases. We talked about Harry Potter, talked about Game of Thrones as a way of doing there. Borrowing behaviors and lateral thinking, I think, is a really interesting thing. Borrowing behaviors from different categories or learning lessons elsewhere that you bring to bear to make something more disruptive in a given market. I think that's really important. So that just hopefully gives everybody who's been on there a few themes. Now, question-wise, a couple have come in. So I'll read this one first. From your experience, what advice can you give people in the industry to push clients beyond their comfort zones and run with a left field idea which you have so much faith in? Do you galvanize other stakeholders in the business, or just keep beating them over the head with the idea?
Well, I think one thing, one of our kind of touch points, I suppose, or key things we try to remember, not really a touch point, is I feel like if to earn media and to get PR, I think you have to have an idea that is creatively risky. And that doesn't mean it is political or anything like that, but it needs to be something, I think, unexpected from that brand or organization. So I think there needs to be, if everybody is entirely comfortable with an idea, then it's probably not the right idea. You need people to feel slightly nervous about it, and not everyone, but you need some people to think, "Ooh, this could backfire." Because I think you need to be a bit, and if you don't, so sometimes the way we approach things is if we are coming up with executional concepts, let's say it is a film, or let's say it's a stunt, or these kind of things, we might have 3 ideas. One is the most kind of risky one, which has the potential to earn the most media, and then you've got a middle one, and then you've got the safest option. And the safest option, we might try and highlight, you will probably have to spend more on media for that because it doesn't have the same level of shareability. And then we would try to, the idea we would believe in the most, I suppose, we would try to, we would probably describe a kind of why it works, and then we would have a sort of, here's 3 reasons, part of our rationale, that we think it's worth taking that creative risk.
Yeah, and I think I'd echo that. For us, it would be how we're making the evidence-backed case that this is the right thing to do, but also talk about long term, not just building a relationship with customers, also with your clients. How have you built a relationship with a client where you do have that freedom? I think the best relationships, you have that freedom where you can go back to them and say, look, I know you didn't like this originally. I'd really love to revisit this. And I think the best client relationships, they will listen and have that respect that you can have that. I mean, there has to be a point where somebody says, we're calling it a day there. But I think it's being able to have the freedom to have the discussion and the dialogue to revisit it as we go back. One more question is coming down here. It's a question from Jonty Gray to you, Joe. Hello, Jonty. Joe, what do you think most charities do wrong?
I think, well, one thing is possibly being overly worried about what nutters on social media think. Because I think, I feel that what I've seen, every organisation any charity we've worked for has a kind of like hardcore of opposition, even to the most kind of like, not just benign things that they're doing, but things that are very, you know, normal right thinking people would say are positive. And I think the kind of troll, basically I'm talking about trolls, I suppose, whereas I think everything is going to get trolled, and I think as long as you have a good response to it, you can manage that. And also it does help algorithmically, doesn't it? Because you will get, if you have a debate going in the comments, it does help push your content higher. And but I also think I've seen it quite a few times where you have people can, maybe not trolls, but people who are anti something can actually change their minds. And sometimes you do see it unfolding in the comments where it's not even the organization leading the response. It can be a response from that organization's followers where they'll say, well, I think you're wrong about this. And actually you can have quite good debates and you can see people change their mind. And so I think having that kind of opposition isn't too bad. And then I think having this is only one part of the answer, but it's but then I think yeah. So I would say because if you are doing things that are also creatively risky, you'll get people to really love it, I think, but you'll also maybe get a few more people who are anti it.
Yeah. Great answer. Now, well, I know we're coming up to closing up time, so one final question. Final question, how do you manage the community reaction to something that doesn't resonate well with audiences? Do you have a legal team to help you with copyright issues, given that you might have risque ideas?
Well, I think we have found, I think in like 2014, the parody laws were changed. So if you are doing something for not for profit, there is a lot more leeway to parody, you know, sort of. So with the Greenpeace Lego example, we were relying on it being okay from a parody law point of view because it wasn't for profit, and that actually turned out to be fine. And also we used the Jungle Book in something else, and again it was fine. So there was a bit more leeway. But I think if it's for a brand or a for profit, I think it is something to be undertaken pretty cautiously, because yeah. So I think, but yeah, we haven't had any. I mean, we haven't had any incidents where it's gone wrong. And I think if it's on social media, on social and digital first, I think there is a lot more leeway because of the amount of you know, people and individuals using other people's IP. And I just think if it's for a brand, I think you just need to, I don't think any lawyer in their right mind would let anything particularly risky go through anyway. So I just think it's getting everything legally checked.
Fantastic. Right, well, that brings us to our time. I mean, that's been a brilliant chat, and I'm sure we'll probably revisit this at some point, Joe, because I think there's lots more topics for us to chip into. The recording will be shared. We'll also share some of the themes and topics we've talked about in the coming days. But Joe, I really appreciate you taking the time this lunchtime. That's been a fascinating chat. I've really enjoyed it. I hope everybody watching it has been. But that's been Joe. I've been Rick, and thank you for watching our webinar. Cheers.
Thank you.